Hello again, everybody. As sad as it is, all good things must come to an end. This is the final video we will be making on the subject of our community-collaborated RockMan EXE Iceberg chart. Today, we'll be covering the unused entries that didn't make the cut for one reason or another. The biggest reason most of them weren't included was that there simply wasn't enough space for all of them. I mean, just look at the chart. It's full to bursting, and even when shrinking down the text to make the final version of the chart that included the bonus entries from the Part 4 video, it's still very cramped. The majority of the entries that were cut likely would have fallen in the middle tiers, and if I made the text any smaller, it'd be almost impossible to read with the template that had been used. Other reasons range from simply not having enough evidence to make a strong point worth considering, or some ideas reached a bit too far, or in some cases I just didn't find them interesting enough to include in the chart. I'm sorry if that offends anyone who submitted entries, but I had to trim the fat somewhere. My goal with this iceberg was to include a good mix of well-known and obscure trivia and lore to make it accessible to newcomers as well as entertaining seasoned fans. But today, we're going to take a look at all the unused submissions in a video that my wife has lovingly named the RockMan EXE Ice Cube. Consider this your spoiler warning, as we're going to be covering a lot of lore and plot points here. For this video, I'll be grouping submissions together by the person who posted them. I think that's the best way to organize this sort of list. This is also going to be a bit more freeform than the previous iceberg videos, even more so than Part 4. So get settled in and get ready to dive back in with us one last time as we take a look at the smaller ice flows that broke off from the bigger iceberg. Up first is an unused entry from Luminator. Mu apparently existed prior to the events of Battle Network, despite no mention of it anywhere. Mention of MegaMan NT Warrior Beast anime in the English trailer for Battle Network 6. Oh, and of course, lest we not forget to give a shout out to the M1GP Discord. They should be in the more shallow levels. Ah yes, we did give a shout out to the M1GP while talking about the esports scene. As for the Beast anime being shown in the Battle Network 6 trailer, I could find no real evidence for this one, and I watched all the trailers that I could find for it, both English and Japanese, as well as the GBA and Wii U trailers. If I missed it, feel free to drop a link in the comments if you can, or the exact title of the video. As for Mu existing before Battle Network and it not being mentioned, that's just something that happens when you retcon a series or make a prequel. Star Force is the direct sequel to Battle Network, but deals with prehistoric tech and ruins, yet Battle Network doesn't even acknowledge it. It's kind of similar to how Kingdom Hearts 2 existed first, and then they released 358 over 2 days and introduced the new character Shion, but had to come up with a plot MacGuffin to explain why the characters don't talk about her, despite her being a major player. Following this thread, let's look at some of Adam the Game Boy's unused entries. Navis were based on MegaMan Tech, which was developed from Aimian or Fimian technology. An interesting theory, and I'm not entirely ruling it out, but we simply don't have enough to go off of for this, and the sets of technology are very different from each other. I've already made mention of this in the previous videos, but the only time the EXE really dealt with prehistory was in the manga with Pharaoh Man and in the anime with Duo's origins. However, both times those were based on networks and computers, not EM waves like the MegaMan Tech from Star Force 2. It's kind of hard to wrap my head around how the whole technology circle thing would work in the first place. Radios existed before computers in the real world, yet in the world of EXE and Star Force, radio waves are somehow more advanced and more versatile than the internet and computers. So where does Mu fit into all this, even if we don't take the anime and manga into account? I'm no expert on either kind of technology, so I couldn't really begin to try to rationalize this from a real-world standpoint. Part of the reason I'm not entirely convinced that Navis were developed from MegaMan Tech is that EM beings require a host to reach their full power, while Navis don't. They work better when being operated by a human though, and you could make the argument that EM wave change is just another form of cross-fusion, and the game simply never explored that avenue. In short, I don't really think it's a bad idea, but I personally don't believe it, and can't really come up with a decent way to try to create a link, other than both technologies doing similar things, which is primarily just to maintain game mechanics and world build since both games are connected. Adam's next suggestion was Merkland/Rings of Cyber Hell. Well, yeah, Merkland is basically Cyber Hell. I don't really see any direct comparison to the Rings of Hell from Dante's Inferno, but I'm also not very well versed in Dante, so those would be lost on me in the first place. But both incarnations of Merkland we visit, Black Earth and Nebula area, are filled with trials for MegaMan and his companions to overcome, fighting against a slew of various enemies as well as overcoming navies corrupted by darkness. Merkland is indeed mentioned in Battle Network 3, and the whole battle chip opens up a gateway to it, allowing the use of dark gigachips. This point is also concurred with by Scroll Skillups, suggesting that the Undernet was based on Sheol, which is prominently featured in the Hebrew Bible, but other translations of the Bible use a different name, such as Abaddon, Sakat, and even Hades. Land is in a coma after Battle Network 2. This basically follows the same veins as the Ash's coma theory about Pokemon, where all of the happenings are just the protagonist's imagination after they encounter a life-endangering event. Since Lan was caught in a very powerful radiation wave, where he even blacked out and lost the ability to move until the servers were shut off, I can see the foundation for this idea. I had an alternate viewpoint on this theory though. Not a coma, but all of Lan's adventures are just in his overactive imagination. This would explain how some of the more absurd moments in the series are justified, since they can make sense to the mind of a child, like criminals not resisting arrest after losing a net battle to a kid. I might elaborate more on this in a future video if I can flesh out the theory a little bit more. Dystopian ethics in the Battle Network universe, talking about rewriting Dr. Regal's personality and such. Well, that certainly is a heavy topic. To be fair, Regal's brainwashing wasn't done by any of the good guys. It was done by Dr. Wily, and after losing the past decade of his memories, Regal turned over a new leaf seemingly of his own volition. But some other dystopian ethics are the digitizing of human souls, like turning Hub into a Navi, or preserving Tadashi Akari's consciousness inside a computer. This is borderline playing God and effectively creates a partial escape from the laws of life and death. And, going deeper, we briefly touched on this in the Iceberg, but if Navis do have souls, is it right or fair to create backup data of them in case of deletion? Doesn't that devalue their lives, meaning that they are expendable if you can just create a copy of them at any moment? I definitely think these are things worth having a dialogue about, but a good chunk of it is just the audience reading a little too deep, or perhaps the writers just not fully thinking through their implications. Speaking of implications, the implications of security gates for weird things, like having to have all the double souls. This one is clearly just a game mechanic meant to be a hard cap on your progress until you've reached certain prerequisites. Other such gates include defeating the final boss in the main game, collecting all the battle chips, or completing any given serendipitous task, like finishing the request BBS or completing all of the quizzes. I don't really have an in-depth lore explanation for this one, unless we're meant to assume that someone is watching Lan and MegaMan at all times and gauging their progress, or again, it's all in Lan's head, and this makes sense to his logic for his imaginary adventure. Lord Wily subconsciously went easy because he wanted Lan to stop him. I mean, I guess it's possible. His sudden change of heart after Colonel and Iris' death in Battle Network 6 does seem to come out of left field. After everything he's done, that is what broke him? Seeing the Navi of his adopted son, Beryl, sacrifice himself and his sister to stop World 3's plan? Maybe he wanted to be defeated all along. Why else would he include a jack import in the room with a light virus rocket within Lan's reach? Or not disable the last open pulse transmission machine during the battle with Alpha? Or just not had a better security system or more competent henchmen to deal with this 10-year-old kid? Is typical storytelling where the hero overcomes the villain and the bad guy is done in by their own hubris. But if we wanted to look too deep, maybe Wily deep down never did want to be evil. After all, he did erase Regal's memories to give him a fresh start after he fell on his own dark path. This one didn't make the list simply because, to me, this is purely speculation. I don't think we really have enough hard evidence to base this one on, and the examples that I mentioned are purely circumstantial. Next is less obvious references to the classic series. Darkman EXE guarding the secret area, and the Darkman units guarding the castle in Mega Man 5, CWU-01P being similar to the Ammonicule virus, and so on. Pretty self-explanatory, but CWU-01P is an enemy surrounded by a bubble, much like the Ammonicule virus, and we have plenty of other throwbacks to classic and other series as well. Rather than shooting projectiles like their classic series counterpart, Metars use pickaxes similar to the Pickle Men from Mega Man 1, which looks like Mets with a full body and a shield. In Network Transmission, we also have enemies like Sniper Joes, Shield Attackers, and Big Eye. I didn't include this one on the list because it was too broad of a category, and we already had some other entries covering such throwbacks, like the Legends references and classic-themed remixes. Now we get into some real conspiracies here. The Mega Man Star Force characters Geo and Kelvin Stellar are descendants of Mr. Famous, as well as Jack and Tia being the descendants of Regal. We don't really have a lot of info to go off of here to draw any meaningful comparison, aside from a few aesthetic similarities. Like, Jack has a similar hairline to Regal, and if Jack is related to him, then Tia has to be related as well, because they're siblings. For Geo and Kelvin being descendants of Mr. Famous, I don't really see a lot of similarities here. I would say that legendary Master Shin is more of the Mr. Famous stand-in, so I think he's more likely to be related to Mr. Famous than the Stellars. If there's been some piece of lore leaked, like in an interview or something that I missed, then I'd like to hear about it. These weren't included because I just couldn't come up with anything creative to say about it one way or another due to lack of tangible evidence. Keeping with the same theme here, we move on to LB Man's submissions. Luna is a descendant of Cherise. For those who don't recall, Cherise is a character exclusive to the mobile game Legend of the Network. She's the operator of Rideman and is from the ancient Atlampian civilization. Again, aside from some design similarities, I don't really see any solid connection between the two. I have even less to go off of for this one because the mobile games still haven't been localized, so I don't know Cherise's full story or interactions, so I can't really draw a comparison between the two. Next was the Shingo Adachi artworks. Shingo Adachi is a Japanese animator who had a big hand in the Beast Plus arc of the anime, as well as both Mega Man Star Force anime series. There apparently was some good info in the art book published in 2019 that contained his works, but currently we don't have public access to scans of this book. That's the biggest reason why I didn't reference it. If I have no scans or solid info to show for the topic, I prefer not to use it. When making content to be informative, it's always good to cite your sources. Let's knock out a few one-offs. From Tanks 135. The trick speedrunners use to avoid virus encounters in Battle Network 1. To summarize it as best I can, random encounters happen on specific frame values within the game's code, and this value can be dodged based on how Mega Man moves, either running straight up or down, along a slant, or diagonally. By alternating movement patterns correctly, a skilled player can minimize the number of random encounters. While speedrunning tech is always fun to learn about, I'm not really prepared to talk in depth about a lot of it because I'm not a speedrunner. I did include the BM1 credits warp because it's easy to pull off, and number doors aren't random was included because I thought it sounded more interesting. I still don't think I did a good enough job explaining that one or this submission, so the best I can do is drop a link in the description to someone who can explain it better than I can. Battle Network speedrunner Taraj42 suggests using a hashtag, probably a virus. Not sure if this was meant to be an entry submission, but I thought it was worth mentioning because it's kind of funny. Llama886 suggests Serenade is Mamoru. I asked them to elaborate further, but got no reply. It's been all but confirmed at this point that Mamoru is Serenade's operator, but as for Mamoru himself being Serenade, that's a completely different matter, and we have next to no information to base this theory on, without major stretches of logic. From Jason Witchfan. There's apparently a cameo from the anime Ojamajo Doremi in the background of episode 25 of the first season of the anime. Right there, that poster above the computer. While I can definitely see some similarities between outfits here, I couldn't find an exact shot this frame could have been taken from. Truth be told, I actually did mean to make mention of this one during the Dragon Ball references entry, where I talk about other anime references in NT Warrior, like Shining Man being a reference to Rainbow Man. I dropped the ball and forgot to include this in the script. Sorry about that. Some other entries focused on possible references are these, submitted by Mattu, who states that in episode 6 of Beast Plus, we can see a gun tank from Gundam, a Surfbot from Mega Man Legends, and Sabrina from Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green. I can kind of see a resemblance to a gun tank here. The colors are similar enough, it's got treads and fins on the head. The only thing really missing are the cannons. As for the Surfbot, the Navi's head is shaped kind of Lego-ish, but I would think that if they're going to make a direct Legends reference, they would be more likely to use the correct colors or unique features, like the big round eyes or circular pincher hands instead of those Cutman scissor-looking pincers. For the girl Navi though, I don't know if this was meant to be a Sabrina reference, but the overall aesthetic is pretty dang similar, pretty close to the male cameo in Powerpuff Girls Z. Following the same trend, Kurao X56S adds that in episode 7 of Beast Plus, there's apparently a doll that is inspired by Ruri from Martian successor Nadesico. It was actually episode 8. The talking dolls were introduced in episode 7, but the Ruri doll shows up early in episode 8. Kurao's other topics were focused on the Cross-Fusion Beast, which appeared in the final episode of the Beast arc, where Cross-Fusion Mega Man deleted the merged Super Psy Beast. This indeed did happen, and we touched on it a bit during the Grayzar entry on the Iceberg. They also suggested a potential fan game following the adventures of Patch and Mega Man Jr. I think I remember hearing about this one. I believe it was called Mega Man Battle Network Legacy? ShadowRockZX has a video discussing this one, but because the project was cancelled long ago, we don't really have a lot of info for it. Again, I dropped the ball and meant to include this in the fan games entry, but this particular one got lost on my notes. My apologies. I'll link ShadowRock's video discussing the subject if I can find it. Eliza's World suggests that a possible reference to the Sonic the Hedgehog OVA might be in the manga. In the first volume, Chapter 5, when Lan and Mega Man go full synchro, it bears some similarity to the scene where we have Sonic and Metal Sonic overlapping. I don't really think this is concrete enough to be a direct reference. Most definitely just a coincidence. We've seen this kind of thing done in other works too. Thanks for the submission though. Stork of the Mudwings suggests that dark chips are simply an analogy for drugs, given that Navis go through withdrawals, demanding to be given more dark chips. The rush they get from using one is intoxicating, but it's ultimately destroying them from within. So this could be seen as some sort of anti-drug PSA wrapped up in a Mega Man anime. I can't say that it's entirely wrong, but this kind of effect was elaborated upon in the dark chip entry on the Iceberg, so mentioning it again would be kind of redundant. Returning contributor Blake Blast has some more entries to offer. Someone poisons the water hole, referencing the incident during Battle Network 1, where unfreezing the waterworks causes polluted water to be dispersed throughout Den City. Unless this is supposed to just be a callback to Toy Story though, I'm not really sure why this one was suggested.
Somebody's poisoned the water hole!
Another one that might warrant further discussion, however, is the idea that maybe in the world of EXE, everybody is superhuman. The suggested evidence is that Lan survives multiple long falls with no injury, like jumping down the waste chute in Scilab to end up in the basement, falling into the Netopia Castle dungeon, and jumping out of the second-story window of the Beach Street Hospital and landing in the ocean, as well as Lan and Sean surviving the massive radiation wave at the end of Battle Network 2, and the other net battlers in Netopia Castle being caught in deadly traps, like being crushed by a ceiling, shot by arrows, or Raoul being set on fire, or maybe electrocuted, I'm not certain, but all of them miraculously surviving with little to no injury. According to Princess Pride, Johnson got crushed by a ceiling trap, but he's back for the M1 Grand Prix in Battle Network 3. Jennifer says that she's close to death from her injuries, yet she comes back later in the game and in the M1 Grand Prix. This is most likely just done to keep the game's rating at E for everybody and having very few instances of actual death, but the ramifications of this imply that humans are quite sturdy in the world of EXE. As for them being superhuman, I don't really have enough evidence to go on to form a strong theory other than circumstantial evidence. Author of the original Battle Network Iceberg, MegaMan, returns with some new suggestions. He submits that a possible religious reference to add to the existing ones was the name of the World 3 Area's song, "And You Will Know the Truth," which could be a reference to a book in the Bible, the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 32. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Maybe, maybe not, but one that I know is a biblical reference that I missed is the Mr. Prague quoting Ezekiel 25:17.
"And I will strike down upon thee with great vengeance and furious anger."
Next is an interesting one from Mercenary Tigre, Element Man's orbs and the symbols emblazoned on them. So, Element Man has 5 attacks. One is wind, and the other 4 correspond to the main 4 elements of the game: fire, aqua, wood, and elect. Element Man takes a note from RockMan EXE by changing color to correspond to whatever attack he's going to use. However, he has 6 orbs on his back, though he only has 5 attacks. These orbs correspond to all 5 of the elemental attributes he uses, but he also has an orb for the null or neutral element. The weird thing here is that the null attribute and the wind element kind of go hand in hand. Based on Element Man's attack pattern, he changes color, attacks with the tornado, which is wind elemented, and then changes to the element of the corresponding color. When he changes color, his base element actually changes to this element as well, meaning that if he's blue for aqua, he's weak to electricity, and so on. But his normal base color, purplish gray, corresponds to the null element, and his attack while in this state is only tornadoes. He doesn't have any null elemented attacks either. We know he's null elemented because he doesn't take double damage from swords, like every other wind attribute enemy does in Battle Network 6. So what's up here? In Battle Network 6 specifically, the element and attribute tables were updated so that all attributes have their own weaknesses for balancing. This is one of those things that just gets weirder the longer you think about it. The best way I can justify it is that he is just a null elemented Navi who can change elements and happens to have a wind-based attack, so he has orbs to reflect those 2 elements. There are other instances of Navis having attacks that don't match their base attributes. Both Colonel and Protoman use sword attacks, but they are not sword elemented like Slashman, and Toadman has an electric attack despite being an aqua-based Navi. Or Planetman in Battle Network 2. His base element is wood, but he has different planets with different elemental attacks and so on. It's kind of weird but interesting to think about, though I don't think this topic is in-depth enough to warrant a spot on the greater Iceberg. Some more from Mercenary Tigre. The sprite and art used for the Godstone is very similar to some enemies from Swordman's stage in MegaMan 8, as well as the laser shooting pillars that Stoneman can summon in Battle Network 1. The Godstone sprite also has arms similar to Stoneman's, so this makes me wonder if there was some virus based on Stoneman's design that was scrapped, then regulated to just being a battle chip. I briefly touched on this one in the Iceberg, but didn't fully elaborate on it. Remember in Battle Network 1, that one kid who wants 30 Met Guard A chips, so he can fuse them together to make Buster Guard? Custom battle chips are a thing in the EXE universe, as we've seen a few different times, but as far as I know, this is the first time we hear about one being created simply by fusing the data of multiple chips to create a single chip instead of a program advance. Battle Network 3 had the Energy Change Navi Customizer part, where you had to sacrifice a battle chip to remove an overworld obstacle. I thought this was basically common knowledge, and it didn't really extend much past that, so that's why I didn't really give it any more thought. A unique mechanic to be sure. Who were the MegaMan and Numberman and Searchman lookalikes in Battle Network 5? They were just Nebula Navis using disguises. Funnily enough, in the DS version, they get some custom mugshots to distinguish them after they've been found out. What became of Zero.exe? We don't know. He just wanders the cyberworld after the events of Network Transmission, assuming he survived the game. Because the actual continuity of Network Transmission is very questionable, we may never know what actually became of Zero, unless the tombstone in the graveyard is meant to signify that he is, in fact, dead. Was ice supposed to be its own element originally? There's a BBS post in Battle Network 1 that makes mention of ice, and they specify that they do water-based damage, yet there's no additional mention of other elements such as rock, wind, or steel. I think the submission was supposed to say Battle Network 2 because there is no BBS in Battle Network 1 as far as I recall. The closest thing I could find to this in Battle Network 2 was people talking about ice panels and how elect-elemented attacks do double damage on top of ice panels. But returning to the subject at hand, I'm not certain if ice was supposed to be its own element, but given that a lot of RPG games do treat water and ice as 2 separate elements, it would make sense. But we also have to think about it from this angle. Several of the Mega Man 1 bosses also show up in Battle Network 1, including Iceman, Fireman, and Electman. In Classic, Iceman is weak to Thunder Beam, which you get from Electman, and Fireman is weak to Ice Slasher, which is gotten from Iceman, and Firestorm is Bombman's weakness. Battle Network 1 follows the same weakness chart, where Iceman is weak to electricity, Fireman is weak to Iceman's attacks, and MegaMan EXE's bombs can be detonated with fire attacks. I don't know if I believe that it was supposed to be a separate element at first, but I absolutely believe they would follow a similar weakness chain to the classic games. Double Souls in Battle Network 2. Some of the style changes you get, like Gut Style, Shadow Style, and Hub Style, seem to take influence from existing characters. Gut Style gives you a large fist similar to Gutsman's, Shadow Style gets a scarf like Shadowman's, as well as giving you anti-damage, and Hub Style is Mega Man unleashing his dormant powers as Hub. Mercenary Tiger theorizes that these might have been the template for the early stages of what would become Double Soul. An interesting idea, but because Battle Network 3 was originally supposed to be the end of the series, I don't think they were looking quite that far ahead. Elemental Mishaps, specifically referring to the second elemental weakness chain in Battle Network 6. Cursor beats guard breaking beats sword, sword beats wind beats cursor. In short, I think the second weakness chain was just added for balancing purposes. These attributes were explored in Battle Networks 4 and 5, but they didn't carry elemental weaknesses. Swords are often made of metal, so something that could pierce a shield, like a Met Guard, could break a sword. Cursor-type weapons harken back to Searchman, who had a sniper gun, and a precision shot could pierce something sturdy like rock or metal. Just the same, a strong wind can make a sniper miss their shot, so it makes sense that wind is strong against Cursor. As for sword beating wind, that one's a little harder to justify since wind is more abstract, but I guess the flat edge of a sword can cut through wind and air and isn't as affected aerodynamically, so that's the logic. On that note, we also have the topic of Wood Style and Wood Soul's charge shots being a tornado. Why a tornado? Like, we have tornado battle chips that are null elemented. Why is the wood charge shot a grassy tornado? Unless it's just meant to represent leaves getting tossed around in a gust of wind? NetNavi gender reveal regarding Serenade. On page 76 of the Battle Network Complete Works, the book calls Serenade he. So the debate is over? Well, the debate is over, but Serenade is not male nor female. They are androgynous, being an ultimate existence that transcends the concept of gender. This was confirmed in an interview that can be seen in a Capcom archive page. However, in the modern days, it would be more correct to refer to Serenade as they, because it has become commonplace to use the they pronoun for singular, not just for plural, in the English language. It should be noted that the translated version of MegaMan NT Warrior also refers to both Serenade as he and she in a few different panels. As for the Legacy Collection, Serenade is still called he and Under King because the developers made the decision to preserve the game's scripts mostly unchanged from the localizations we got 20 years ago, which means that Battle Network 4 specifically is still a dumpster fire of mistranslation. And lastly from Mercenary Tigre, more possible Marvel references. We know that Marvel and Capcom go way back, so are there some Marvel references beyond IronMan.exe? Is Searchman a reference to the Winter Soldier, a long-haired sharpshooter from Russia, or a Russian equivalent, who was first kind of chaotic but eventually became a hero? And Laserman's eye laser has a similar sound effect to Cyclops' Optic Blast from Marvel vs. Capcom 1 and 2.
Optic Blast! Optic Blast! Optic Blast! Optic Blast!
There was a lot to unpack, but as for why these specifically didn't get used, it was a combination of too much speculation without enough evidence, some points already being proven or not warranting their own entries, or I simply couldn't find a place for them compared to some of the other entries. In addition to deciding what went on the iceberg, I also had to decide where the entries went, and the mid-tiers, which is where I would have put most of these, got pretty crowded, as you can tell. Next we have an entry from Triggs that reads as follows. There is one I would like someone to talk about, but I don't think anyone can believe it, which is how Hub and his conversion to Mega Man was the root of figuring out how Navis are able to gain free will, which is oddly similar to how Reploids in the MegaMan EXE series can also thank X for their free will. Sadly, NetNavi age is something we cannot confirm, excluding Topman scenario. Otherwise, all conscious Navis would have to be 11 years old from the start of the series if this was true. In a sense, this also kinda explains why Mega Man is in so many of the battle chip art, as he was used for testing them out before Len came of age to get his own Navi. As for No Robot Before X having true free will, I still feel like that's a subject that can be debated, but not today. Not sure if all other conscious Navis are exactly 11 years old, but I do agree that Hub's soul being digitized was pivotal in creating the new generation of NetNavi. Dr. Ikari states that he was already working on ways to make Navis more human-like, and that Hub's birth and death took place during the entire process, and his revival as Mega Man gave him the means to complete his research. This tragedy turned into the crux of Land of Mega Man's advantage against all future opponents. But, as Dr. Regal said, Dr. Ikari's research on the network and Navis led to a spike in net crime. This isn't to say that Dr. Ikari was entirely at fault for all this, mind you. People are free to make whatever choices they want with what they have, so he can't be blamed for everything that Dr. Wily and the other criminals did. Sorry, that was a bit of a different tangent. But back to the submission. Regarding Mega Man being on so many battle chips and testing them specifically for LAN, I don't really think that the developers were thinking about the lore implications with these portraits, especially when we have some battle chips that change icons to include Mega Man in the later games, like Invis becoming Invisible. These didn't make the list because I felt like spelling it out might have been a bit repetitive, since we do talk about navis being made from DNA and the implications on a separate entry. And Mega Man being on so many battle chips is still a mystery, and I think it's just something to be chalked up to game mechanics. This one comes to us from Kirby Zero, formerly known as Model R. Lan's descendant dies at the end of Star Force 4. The idea here is that Kazuma would be possessed by some new EM alien threat, and, left with no other choice, Mega Man would have to execute him. We know next to nothing about Star Force 4 other than the basic premise, but I could absolutely see some conflict rise between them due to difference in morality. Geo has mostly been lawful good in the series up to this point, so him being an outlaw is strange enough. Maybe down the line, his and Kazuma's partnership will be strained by the criminal activity they have to partake in as a result of their hacking. Maybe Geo is forced to fight former friends like Ace and Sonya, and eventually he would decide to come clean, and when he tries to leave, Kazuma tries to stop him, leading to Kazuma becoming an antagonist. Again, all speculation since we don't have much to go on from Star Force 4's scrap development. The Cool Pangoro asks some questions regarding Navi families, such as the Cutman brothers. The Cutman brothers all have varying designs, even an elderly one, who are all separate from the original Cutman, who is based on CutMan EXE's appearance from the game. This implies that some form of reproduction as well as aging is possible in Navis. As for having Navi families, I think this is mostly a matter of Navis being programmed or designed by the same person, or using a similar template. In the manga, Spoutman and Bubbleman are brothers despite them having no relationship in the games. Although in Battle Network 3, Bubbleman and Drillman are supposedly related. As for aging, that one's kind of up in the air. We know that Topman EXE, as well as other navis operated by senior citizens in the anime, were all designed specifically to be elderly, so it could be a similar case here. The only instance I recall of actual aging for a Navi and not simple degradation over time is that of Trill in the anime, but he was created via unconventional means since he was the synchronizer given physical form and he's from an alternate dimension, so he's not really a good example to set a standard around. This is an interesting topic, but I don't really know how to elaborate further on it outside what we can already see or what other deeper lore implications this might bring with it. The second question Pangoro posed is why Creamland still has a monarch despite being a developed country in the semi-futuristic setting of Battle Network. I don't really think that's too odd. Even our modern world, which exists 20 years after Battle Network was released, has developed countries with monarchs, like England. We aren't really given insight into many other governments in this world, however, so we don't really know what forms of government nations like Electopia, Sharo, or Nettopia might have. A note from Grisidui says that we should discuss Armarouge and Ceruledge from Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, because they look like Navis. Yeah, the internet took that and ran with it. They really do look like they should be Mega Man characters, but Works taking design influence from others is nothing new, really. Remember when that JoJo stand became a Yu-Gi-Oh card? A few entries from Pick Angel 13. Hub.Bat was deleted. The idea states the possibility that the Mega Man we have in Battle Network 4 is not the same one from the end of Battle Network 3, since Hub.Bat can't be copied and it was lost within Alpha, and Hub would not return until Battle Network 5. This also could account for the transition from style change to Double Soul. I actually covered this topic in a Q&A video I did a while back. I don't really think that Hub.Bat was deleted from Mega Man. It's within his code now, but believed to be deactivated until he engages Hub style or Hub form, as stated in Battle Network 2. Regardless, it's not necessarily tied to style change directly though. That was Change.Bat, the treasure of Yumland. Although it is kind of strange how Hub.Batch, the Navi customizer part, and Gigachip have to be found in the post-game of Battle Network 3, 4, and 6. This one is just more of a fun headcanon, which is why it didn't make the list, but all of the OST from the series is coming from Lan's PET. In the way that cell phones have been able to play music for a while, some think that Lan is playing his own soundtrack from his PET wherever he goes. It's a fun idea, but if he is, then shouldn't someone mention it? Like if they're trying to be stealthy, someone should tell him to turn the music off or put in headphones. Fun idea, but I don't think it's true. 010 Last offers us the tidbit that despite both the GBA and DS version of Battle Network 5 being translated, they did not use the GBA version as the template for translation. I believe that, since there are some subtle script differences in between versions. The most prominent one I remember is during the final stretch of the endgame, where in the GBA version, Mega Man says, "I'm on fire," whereas in the DS version, he says, "I'm on flames." Those words mean the same thing, but given the context, that sentence doesn't grammatically make sense in English. I don't really know where or how I would have incorporated this one into the Iceberg, so I just didn't. Danny Jenny Arts submitted the request to look at other pieces of RockMan EXE merch, like several Gashapon figures and the various attachments for the Progress PET and such. While some of these are nice to look at and some just look weird, I didn't include them because covering toys in general was such a wide topic that it would have taken up way too much time in the video, and we already had a large number of toys that we talked about, like the hero sword and the helmet, as well as some region exclusives and prototype figures. The protos were included in the updated Iceberg because I felt that unreleased merch and unique oddities add a bit to the story of the IP and franchise. But like I said in the other videos, I really wish I had money to collect all of it. Keeping with the topic of merchandise, we have Blubbery Blub's unused entries talking about modding real-life battle chips, which can be done by soldering the circuit board of the advanced PET chips. I'll link a video showing how this works in the description. There's also an item on eBay that basically works as an all-in-one battle chip for functionality's sake, that could be used with the advanced PET or battle chip gate. There was an MT Warrior trading card game, as well as a board game and the Mega Cubes. I briefly touched on them in the first Iceberg video, but didn't fully elaborate. I didn't think this was really the place to fully dive into the particulars about every single piece of merch from the franchise, because there was just so much to talk about. I did bring up the fact that the Mega Cubes show up in Battle Network 3, though. Now this one we touched on fairly recently in a collab with Gavin Dragon. EXE is the most powerful Mega Man, at least according to Death Battle. When comparing the feats that EXE has accomplished compared to most of the other Mega Men, EXE seems to be head and shoulders above the others, with Star Force being a close second. We already unpacked our feelings in a separate video, so I'll keep this brief. While I do think the Death Battle often does make some good points with some of the numbers they present, they do often take things out of context, exaggerate certain points, and often spin the narrative of the battle to fit whoever they want to win. I don't dislike Death Battle, I think they're quite entertaining, but I don't think they should be cited as authorities on any given subject when it comes to character battles. The exception that I would grant here is when it comes to characters from IPs owned by their parent company, Rooster Teeth, but that's its own can of worms that I don't want to open today. As for whether or not EXE is the most powerful Mega Man, that comes down to which version we use, since we can't assume that all incarnations of Mega Man in any form of media share all of the exact same powers, skills, and feats. But again, we went over this in a different video. From Temel, we have the topic of aliens being in both the classic and EXE timelines. A lot of people place the crux of the timeline split between the two on what Dr. Thomas Light, or Tadashi Hikari, dedicates his life to studying. Light studies robotics, while Hikari studies networks. But by this logic, this shouldn't affect aliens who came from outer space, like the Star Droids from Mega Man 5 for Game Boy, either version of Duo, or the FMians. This also apparently means that Robot Master Shadow Man should still exist in the EXE timeline, since Shadow Man was created by aliens. This would mean that in order for the events to take place without causing severe overlap, they would have to not be separate timelines, but separate dimensions entirely. Or at the very least, the shift in the timeline has to be greater than Thomas Light or Tadashi Hikari choosing a specific career path. This is another instance of an entry getting lost with some of my notes that didn't make it into the final script. I meant to add this to the separate timeline entry, but because I write scripts on my phone during my day job, sometimes not all of my notes end up in the final script. This was the case with the Anetta and Silk entry on the final Iceberg as well, where it was supposed to be on the chart before the final version, but mismanagement on my part left it behind. In this case, I dropped the ball yet again, and this is a very good discussion point. My bad, Tamel. Ron Mankey brings up an old webcomic, MegaMan Battle Network 7 The World Tournament. The site for this comic is down, and the only piece of media that I can find for it is a page from TV Tropes giving details about the project, as well as a tournament bracket chart. This one wasn't included simply because there's not much to go on, and I tried to limit fan works being included in the Iceberg unless they had a large noticeable impact on the community, like the fan games and the esports scene. At some point in the future, I would like to cover every EXE fan work I can get my hands on, from ROM hacks to even possibly some well-crafted fanfics. And our final entry to cover, from RockMan Slayer 00, Navis in Star Force. This addresses the subject that most people in Star Force, at least in the first two games, don't really seem to have a Navi of their own. Wizards became the new Navis in Star Force 3, at least thematically. While there are Navis of sorts, like random NPCs and vendors, we also have various EM beings who operate machinery. But the subject here is how we can go from a society where nearly everybody has a faithful AI companion to just 200 years later, and they're not commonplace anymore. So were all these Navis just abandoned and discarded along with all the PETs in the dump? Kind of a sad thought. I feel like I should have touched on this in that specific entry for the Iceberg as well. Again, my bad. And with that, we close out our community collaborated Iceberg project. I apologize if I missed any entries that weren't repeated elsewhere or merged with others, but I combed over all the notes that I could find multiple times while writing this script. So if I missed any this time, I had to live with this shame. Again, I'd like to extend a most heartfelt thanks to everybody who contributed and who stuck with us for this year-long project. Words cannot express how grateful I am to everyone who helped out, as the Iceberg videos were one of the things that put us on the map with the Mega Man community, and we really couldn't have done it without your help. And now, we can lay this project to rest and move forward, onward to new endeavors. We hope that you'll stick with us as we forge ahead into whatever the future has in store for us. This has been Blade Cross EXE, part of Flash and Blades Productions. Thank you all so much for watching and for being a part of this wonderful community, and we'll see you in the next video or stream. Peace out.